Welcome, friends, to American Pulse and Paranormal. Whether you're winding down after a long day or seeking a touch of mystery in the dark, feel free to enjoy this tale at any time. Let the gentle sound of rain guide you through the story as we dive into an unsettling mystery that might just follow you into the quiet of your own home. Sit back, relax, and let the night unfold. Story 1: The Silent Caller. It was a cold, quiet Wednesday night when Emma first heard the phone ring. The sound sliced through the stillness of her apartment, sharp and unsettling, like the toll of a distant bell. She glanced at the clock, 11:57 p.m. The soft patter of rain outside had just begun to intensify, tapping against the window like fingers drumming in the dark. Sitting alone in the living room, Emma felt the weight of the silence pressing in. She had been scrolling through her phone, trying to unwind after a long day at work. The light from her screen illuminated the room, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should. She didn't want to be alone tonight, but the city outside seemed even lonelier. The phone rang again, louder this time, cutting through her thoughts. Emma hesitated. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, an unsaved contact. She leaned back into the couch, the buzz of anxiety creeping up her spine. The rain was getting heavier now, and the sound of it hitting the roof was almost deafening. The phone kept ringing insistent. After a few more moments of hesitation, she reached for it, swiping the screen to answer. "Hello," she said, her voice barely louder than a whisper, as if she were afraid to disturb the fragile quiet of the night. At first, there was nothing but a heavy silence on the other end. Emma held the phone to her ear, the only sound the quiet thrum of her heart in her chest. She waited for what felt like an eternity. Her breath caught in her throat, and the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deepening. Still no one spoke. Then, just as she was about to hang up, she heard it, slow, deliberate, as if someone was breathing through the phone. A long, drawn-out exhale. The sound was heavy, almost suffocating, and it sent a chill down Emma's spine. She instinctively pulled the phone away from her ear, staring at it in disbelief. The breath continued, slow and steady, like the rhythm of something far older than her. It wasn't the sound of someone on the other line. No voice, no words. Just that eerie deep breath. "Hello?" Emma asked again, her voice trembling. "Who is this?" There was no response. Her pulse quickened, and she glanced nervously around the room, the shadows around her seeming to stretch and twitch with her growing unease. The phone remained pressed to her ear, but the silence was deafening now. It felt as though something unseen was watching her, listening, waiting. And then the whisper came, faint at first, just a murmur, a barely audible sound that crawled out from the depths of the line. It was so quiet, so soft, that Emma couldn't make out the words. But it wasn't a voice like any she had heard before. The whisper carried with it a weight, a gravity, that seemed to seep into the very air around her. "Who is this?" Emma repeated, her voice rising slightly, though she was terrified of what might come next. The only answer was the breath, heavier now, closer, as if the person, or whatever it was on the other side of the wall, right behind her. A shiver ran down Emma's spine, but she couldn't bring herself to hang up. Something in her mind told her not to. She felt frozen, trapped by the invisible presence on the other end of the line. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the call cut off. The line went dead, the silence returning in a rush, leaving Emma staring at her phone, heart pounding in her chest. She blinked, disoriented, unsure of what had just happened. Had she imagined it? The rain outside continued to drum against the windows, but the atmosphere in the room had changed. The air felt thicker now, heavier with an unseen presence. Emma sat there for a long moment, staring at the screen of her phone. The notification bar at the top flickered. Another call. It was from the same number. Her hands shook as she reached for the phone once more, her fingers cold against the smooth surface. She stared at the screen for a long moment before answering, the dread pooling in her stomach. "Hello," she said again, her voice quiet, almost too soft to hear over the sound of the rain. No breath this time, no whisper, just silence. A silence that stretched on unbroken, as if the call had never happened at all. Emma held the phone to her ear, waiting for something, anything. But there was nothing. Only the steady pulse of her own heartbeat in her chest, and the relentless sound of the rain. The seconds ticked by. 1, 2, 3. And then she heard it again. That breath. That slow, deliberate exhale, like the air was being sucked out of her lungs, as though it were coming from deep within the phone itself. Her body tensed. She had to do something. She had to end this. "Who is this?" she asked again, her voice hoarse now, the words barely escaping her lips. The breath continued, this time louder, sharper, almost as if it were mocking her. Suddenly, a faint click echoed in the receiver, and the call ended, leaving Emma holding the phone with trembling hands. She stared at the screen once more, the glowing number mocking her in the dark. Who was this? And why had they called her? Emma sat in the darkness, her fingers cold against the phone's surface. The rain outside was now a relentless downpour, its steady beat against the windows almost deafening in the silence of the room. Her breath was shallow, and her heart seemed to race in time with the ticking seconds. She had to calm down, had to make sense of what had just happened. But the strange call, the voice, the breath, it all felt so real. Too real. She glanced at the screen again. The number blinked back at her, almost taunting her. A quick chill ran through her body as she thought about whether she should answer. Every instinct in her told her not to leave it and just try to sleep. But curiosity gnawed at her, pushing her forward. "Don't answer it," she whispered to herself, but her fingers were already moving. She reached for the phone again, eyes locked on the strange number that seemed to be calling her repeatedly. There was no way this could be a coincidence. She swiped the screen. "Hello," she said, her voice almost a whisper, a fragile thread that felt like it might snap at any moment. The moment she spoke, the same breath came through, this time deeper, almost like it was in the room with her. The chill in the air seemed to intensify. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, and her pulse quickened. The breath was close now, too close. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice shaking more than she cared to admit. Her chest felt tight, as if the air had thickened around her, pressing in on her. She waited for a reply, her body rigid with tension. Nothing. The silence stretched on unbearable, suffocating. But it was then that something different happened. Instead of the usual slow exhale, she heard a faint clicking sound. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And then the voice. It came in a low rasp, so faint that she had to strain to hear it. "You're not alone," the voice whispered, each word heavy with menace, like it was being spoken from the shadows. Emma's breath caught in her throat. The words echoed in her mind, swirling, repeating. "You're not alone." She wasn't sure what was worse, the words themselves, or the fact that they seemed to come from somewhere far behind her, from the darkness itself. The line went dead again. Another click, another disconnection. Emma felt a wave of nausea rise in her stomach. She couldn't stay here. Not anymore. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just some prank. Whatever this was, it was real, and it was coming for her. She stood up abruptly, the phone slipping from her hand, onto the couch. She paced the room, her feet heavy against the floor, the sound of the rain now a constant, oppressive presence. She tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered in the back of her mind. "You're not alone." The words twisted inside her, tightening around her chest. She tried calling her best friend, Sarah, but the phone went straight to voicemail. She tried calling her parents, but they didn't pick up either. It felt like the walls were closing in, like the world was slipping away from her. As the minutes dragged on, she felt more and more certain that something wasn't right. The phone had gone silent again. No new calls. But the sense of something lingering in the room with her was undeniable. The air felt thick, heavy, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than before, twisting unnaturally in the dim light of the room. Then, as if it had been waiting for her to let down her guard, the phone rang again. Her heart stopped. The same number. Her hand shook as she reached for it. She didn't know why she answered this time, whether it was sheer terror or an inexplicable compulsion to know who, or what, was on the other side of the line. "Hello?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. This time, there was no breath. No whisper, just a sound, a noise that sent ice through her veins. It was a scraping sound, like nails on glass. The sound of something sharp and cruel, scraping closer and closer to her ear, until she thought her eardrum might shatter from the intensity of it. And then a voice, deep and guttural, filled with static. "Get out," it said, the words jagged, like they were being dragged from the depths of something terrible. Now, the line went dead, leaving Emma frozen in place, the phone slipping from her hand. The air was thick with terror, and for the first time that night, Emma felt it. The undeniable certainty that whatever was on the other end of that phone wasn't just trying to scare her. It was real. It was here. The lights flickered once, twice. Then they went out completely. Darkness enveloped her, pressing in from all sides. And the only sound in the room was the pounding of the rain against the windows, now deafening in the quiet of the apartment. Emma turned, her heart racing in her chest, her hands trembling as she searched for a light. But then, just as quickly as the power had gone out, it came back on. The lights hummed back to life, but the feeling of dread remained. There was no comfort in the glow of the light now. It felt wrong. She grabbed her phone and tried calling for help again, but the screen flickered. The battery was full, yet the phone refused to respond. The screen went black, and that's when she heard it. A soft click, a breath. It was close, too close. She wasn't alone anymore. Story 2. The Forgotten Neighbor. It was an ordinary evening, or at least it seemed like one. The kind of evening where you sit in your apartment after a long day, turning off the world outside and just basking in the quiet of your home. Megan was no different. She had just moved into her new place in the quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The apartment was small, but it had everything she needed. A cozy living room, a kitchen with a little too much counter space, and a single bedroom that looked out onto the street. It was the perfect escape from the chaos of her previous life. The first few weeks had been peaceful. Too peaceful, some might say. The kind of peace that makes you forget what real silence feels like. The kind of silence that gnaws at your senses and leaves you wondering if something is just out of reach waiting. That night, after a light dinner and a few episodes of her favorite show, Megan decided to relax with a book. The rain had started to fall softly outside, a gentle patter on the windows that seemed to lull her into a deeper sense of calm. She curled up on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, the soft glow of her lamp casting long shadows across the room. The clock on the wall ticked away, each second sinking her deeper into the quiet comfort of her new life. But as she opened the book, a strange sound interrupted her. a soft knocking at the door. It was faint at first, so quiet she wasn't sure if she had actually heard it. She paused, waiting. The rain outside was steady, but this knock was different, almost like it was coming from within the walls themselves. There was again, clearer this time. A slow, deliberate knock. 3 knocks in succession. Megan's brow furrowed. She wasn't expecting anyone, and none of her neighbors had visited yet. She rose from the couch, her steps hesitant. The knock came once more, this time louder. But when she opened the door, no one was there. A shiver crawled up her spine as she looked up and down the empty hallway. There was no sign of anyone, just the dim, flickering lights in the hallway. She stepped back inside, closing the door behind her. Her thoughts immediately started to race. Maybe it was just the wind, or maybe someone had knocked by accident. But then, something caught her eye. At the end of the hallway, the door to the apartment across from hers was slightly ajar. Megan hadn't noticed it before, but now it seemed as though it had been left that way for a while. The door was barely open, just enough to let the dim light from inside spill out into the dark hallway. It looked like the kind of door you'd see in an old house, the kind that squeaks when you open it, the kind that no one bothers to close properly. She stared at the door for a long time, feeling an odd sense of unease. It wasn't like the other apartments in the building. Most of the neighbors kept their doors closed and locked. But this one was different. The air around it seemed to throb with something she couldn't quite name. Her fingers tightened around the door handle, the feeling of being watched creeping up on her. Megan was about to turn away when she heard it, just a whisper, barely audible above the sound of the rain. Megan, she froze. The whisper came from the open door. It wasn't a voice she recognized. It was low, almost a hiss, like something was calling her from the shadows inside. Her heart skipped a beat. She should leave. She should call the landlord or the police. But the curiosity gnawed at her, and before she could stop herself, she took a step forward. The air in the hallway felt cold now, unnaturally cold. The rain had stopped outside, but inside, it was as if the temperature had dropped by several degrees in an instant. Megan swallowed hard, her throat dry, as she approached the open door. The whisper came again, but this time it was louder, more insistent. Megan, come in. She hesitated. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as the door creaked open a little more. The apartment inside was pitch dark, except for a single flickering light in the far corner. It cast long, eerie shadows that danced along the walls. Megan stepped closer, her feet heavy on the floor, each step slower than the last. Suddenly, the door slammed shut. The sound echoed down the hallway, and Megan jumped back, her heart racing in her chest. The apartment was quiet once more. The whisper had stopped, the shadows had vanished, and she was left standing alone in the hallway, staring at the closed door. Her pulse thudded in her ears, and her hands were clammy. She could still feel the presence in the air, the heavy weight of something unseen watching her from the other side. She turned to walk back to her apartment, but as she reached for the doorknob, she saw something else. A shadow moving behind the frosted glass of her door. Megan froze as she stared at the shadow moving behind the frosted glass of her door. The figure was barely visible, but she could make out the distinct shape of someone standing just beyond the glass. Her breath hitched in her throat, and her feet felt cemented to the floor. The faint outline of a face lingered for a moment before the shadow shifted, as though it were stepping away from the door. Her heart hammered in her chest. She had to leave. Her mind screamed for her to turn around and run, but her body refused to obey. The presence she had felt moments before, cold, oppressive, like something ancient and malevolent, seemed to be pulling her back toward that door, toward whatever lay on the other side. She forced herself to break away, her hands trembling as she fumbled for the door handle of her own apartment. Her pulse echoed in her ears, a deafening rhythm that drowned out everything else. She didn't even hear the sound of footsteps approaching her from behind. Then, just as she reached for the doorknob, a voice whispered again, this time unmistakably close. "Megan?" She whipped around, eyes wide with panic, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, just the flickering lights and the hollow silence stretching out before her. The voice, that voice, came from behind her, from the other side of the door across the hall. She felt an icy chill run through her veins. The whisper had been too real, too close, to be a figment of her imagination. Something was in that apartment. Something or someone wanted her to come inside. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her shaking hands. There was no way she could just ignore it. No way she could pretend like it wasn't happening. If she didn't find out what was going on, the fear would eat her alive. But at the same time, a deep sense of foreboding twisted in her gut, telling her she was playing with fire. She walked back to the apartment across the hall, her feet dragging, each step more reluctant than the last. The door was still ajar, just enough to allow a sliver of light to spill out. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting someone to be standing behind her, but the hallway remained empty. With a deep breath, Megan pushed the door open a little further, her hands cold and slick with sweat. The smell hit her first, dust, decay, something musty, like an old forgotten place. The apartment inside was dark, save for the flickering light in the far corner, casting strange, warped shadows on the walls. The furniture inside was shrouded in old sheets, some even torn and weathered, as though it had been abandoned for years. There was a sense of wrongness in the air. It wasn't just the dust or the shadows. It was something deeper, something alive, something that didn't belong. Megan took another step into the room, the floorboards creaking underfoot. Her breath caught in her throat as she glanced around, her eyes falling on an old, worn armchair sitting near the window. On the seat was a thick layer of dust, but that wasn't what caught her attention. What made her heart stop was the shape of something, or rather someone, sitting in the chair. The figure was hunched over, its face hidden in shadow, but the unmistakable outline of a person was there. Megan's first instinct was to run, to get as far away as possible, but the cold grip of fear held her still. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just sat there, as though waiting for her to approach. "Megan," the voice came again, but this time it wasn't from the chair. It wasn't from anywhere around her. It was inside her mind, crawling into her thoughts, chilling her very soul. She could hear it clearly now, almost like it was inside the very air she breathed. The room seemed to grow darker with each passing second, the shadows reaching out like hands, pulling her closer to the figure in the chair. She should have left. She should have turned and never looked back. But curiosity, fear, and something deeper, something that whispered in the back of her mind, urged her to move forward. With a shaking breath, she took a step closer to the chair. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet, the air thick and suffocating. Every instinct in her screamed to run, but she couldn't tear herself away from the figure. She had to know. She had to see who or what was sitting there. "Megan," the voice whispered again, but this time the sound wasn't distant. It was right behind her. She spun around, her eyes darting across the room, but there was nothing, just the silence, the shadows, and the oppressive weight of something unseen pressing in on her. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her pulse pounding in her ears. There was no way out. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening crash. Her heart leapt in her chest, and for a moment, she thought she might faint. But she couldn't let herself lose control. Not now. not when she was so close to uncovering the truth. She turned back to the chair. The figure hadn't moved, but something had changed. It wasn't just sitting anymore. The figure was standing. Its face was still hidden in shadow. But now, Megan could hear the faintest sound, a scraping, dragging sound, like fingernails on a chalkboard. The noise crawled under her skin, sending waves of nausea through her. The figure took a slow, deliberate step toward her, and then another. Megan, the voice was louder now, as if it was coming from right behind her. She couldn't breathe. Story 3. The Watcher in the Walls. The night was unnaturally quiet. The kind of quiet that crawls under your skin, making you feel as though you're being watched from the corners of your own home. Samantha sat at her desk, her fingers still on the keyboard, staring at the blank document in front of her. The soft hum of her computer was the only sound in the otherwise still apartment. Outside, the rain beat relentlessly against the window, tapping like a soft, rhythmic heartbeat. She'd moved into this old building just a month ago. The apartment wasn't much, but it was affordable and close to her work. There were a few things she hadn't liked about the place when she first arrived. The way the hallways always seemed darker than they should have been. The strange drafts that slipped through the cracks even when all the windows were shut. But she had pushed all of that aside. It was a cheap apartment in the city, and at the time that was enough. It had been a long week at work, and Samantha just wanted to relax. She'd poured herself a glass of wine and opened her laptop, hoping to get some writing done before bed. But her thoughts kept drifting back to the apartment itself. The strange sounds she'd heard the previous night, scratching noises coming from the walls, or perhaps from somewhere deeper in the building. She'd assumed it was just the building settling, an old structure creaking under the weight of time. But now, sitting in silence, it seemed different. A faint noise broke her concentration, a soft, almost imperceptible scratching sound. She tensed, her fingers stilling on the keyboard. Her eyes flicked to the wall behind her, and she held her breath, waiting. Nothing. The noise stopped as quickly as it had started. Samantha tried to shake it off, returning her attention to the screen. But the hairs on the back of her neck were prickling. There it was again, the scratching. This time it was louder, more deliberate. It came from the wall to her left, the same wall that separated her apartment from the one next door. She stood up, walking over to the wall, her steps slow and cautious. Her fingers hovered above the surface, and for a moment, she was unsure whether she was being paranoid or whether there was something genuinely strange happening. The scratching came again. This time it was unmistakable. She pressed her ear to the wall, straining to hear. The sound was like claws scraping against wood, sharp and relentless. But the wall was solid, no holes, no cracks, nothing that would explain the noise. Samantha pulled away, her heart racing. She felt uneasy, but she told herself it was nothing. It had to be nothing. Maybe it was just a rat in the walls, or an old pipe that needed fixing. She had heard stories of older buildings having strange noises, especially late at night. But then came the whisper. It wasn't a voice. Not exactly. It was a sound, something between a breath and a word. A faint murmur, so soft that it almost seemed like her imagination was playing tricks on her. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the empty room. The apartment was still. The only light was the soft glow from her desk lamp, casting long shadows across the floor. She listened again, but all she could hear was the rain. It was as if the whisper had never been there at all. Maybe it had been a trick of the wind. Maybe. But then the scratching came back. Louder this time, more urgent, as if whatever was on the other side of the wall was trying to escape. Samantha froze. Her pulse quickened, and she couldn't breathe for a moment. There was something in the wall, something alive. The sound stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with tension. Samantha stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest. The air in the apartment felt heavier now, as though something unseen had just entered the room. Her eyes darted to the door, to the window, to anything that might give her an excuse to leave. But the apartment was still, too still. The scratching came again, but this time it wasn't coming from the wall. It was coming from behind her. Samantha spun around, her breath catching in her throat. There, in the dim light, she saw something move. A shadow, just a flicker, but enough to make her heart stop. Her eyes locked onto the spot, and for a moment, she thought she was imagining things. But then the shadow moved again, closer, too close, and the air around her grew cold. She stumbled back, her hand reaching for the door handle, but it was too late. There was a soft click, and the door was locked. She could feel it now, whatever it was, close. It was in the room with her. Samantha could hear breathing now, deep and labored, like someone or something was standing just behind her. She turned slowly, her body trembling, and then in the corner of the room, she saw it. A figure, barely visible in the dim light. Its shape was distorted, the shadows around it moving like liquid. It didn't have a face, at least not one she could see, but she could feel its eyes on her. She could feel its presence, cold and heavy, pressing in from all sides. The figure didn't move, but the air around it seemed to vibrate, like it was alive in ways that defied reason. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The room was empty again, but the air was still thick, too thick, as if something was waiting. Samantha's pulse raced as she reached for the door once again, but the handle wouldn't budge. The coldness in the room had settled deep into her bones, and no matter how hard she tried to open the door, it remained locked. She was trapped. The scratching started again, this time louder, closer, and whatever it was behind the wall wasn't trying to get out anymore. It was coming in. Samantha's breath came in ragged gasps as she backed away from the door, her fingers still gripping the cold handle. It was useless. No matter how much she twisted, it wouldn't open. The feeling of being trapped in the apartment, this apartment, was overwhelming. The walls seemed to press in, suffocating her with their silence. Her eyes darted to the window. The storm outside raged on, the rain now hammering against the glass with relentless force. The streetlights barely broke through the downpour, casting long, distorted shadows on the floor. Everything outside seemed distant, unreachable. She wasn't going anywhere. The scratching came again, closer this time and louder, as if whatever was inside the walls had grown impatient. The sound wasn't just a quiet, faint noise anymore. It was a thudding, a scraping, something trying to get through. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, the bone-deep knowledge that something was lurking just beyond her reach, something alive and determined. Her pulse throbbed in her temples as she frantically searched the room, eyes wild. The shadows in the corners seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat, twisting and expanding. She could swear she saw them move, but that couldn't be right. Shadows don't move. The whispering started again, low and guttural. It was soft at first, like a breeze, a breath. Then, louder, clearer. She could hear the words, though they made no sense at all. Maybe. The voice rasped from the direction of the wall, but it wasn't just the wall anymore. The entire room seemed to hum, vibrating with the sound of it. Her head spun as the whispers grew louder, more insistent, their syllables jumbled and broken. Then, without warning, the air went completely still. The room was dead silent, the weight of it pressing down on her chest. The scratching was gone. The whispering had stopped. For a moment, Samantha wondered if it had all been a figment of her imagination. But the silence wasn't peaceful. It was unnatural. Her heart pounded in her ears as she reached out, cautiously, toward the wall where the noise had been coming from. Her hand hovered just inches from the surface, the air around her growing colder with each passing second. And then it happened. With a sickening crack, something shifted behind the wall. The surface buckled, the plaster cracking, as if something heavy was pushing against it from the other side. Samantha stumbled backward, a scream bubbling up in her throat, but she clamped her hand over her mouth to stifle it. The wall was alive. The sensation was unmistakable now. Something behind it was pushing, clawing, trying to break free. She could see the jagged lines where the wall had begun to split, the shape of it rippling, as if whatever was trapped there was moving. The shadows in the room seemed to grow longer. They stretched toward her, reaching. Samantha wanted to run, wanted to scream, but her body was frozen in place. The apartment was alive now. It was aware of her. And then the worst part came. A shape began to emerge from the wall. At first it was just a silhouette, distorted and vague, but it quickly became more defined. It was tall, impossibly tall. Its form stretched unnaturally thin. Its limbs seemed too long, its body too lanky, as if it didn't belong in the world of flesh and bone. It had no face, no features that Samantha could make out, only an empty void where its head should have been. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring every second of her fear. Samantha's body tensed, her muscles screaming for her to move, but all she could do was watch. The thing in the wall was coming for her. And it wasn't just in the wall anymore. It was in the room. She backed into the corner, her legs weak beneath her. The figure tilted its head, its shape bending unnaturally as it focused on her with an almost predatory curiosity. The shadows that had once filled the room seemed to pull toward it, as though they were an extension of its being, part of its unnatural presence. Samantha's breath hitched in her throat as she took another step backward, closer to the door. But the sound of something sliding across the floor froze her in place. Something was moving across the room toward her. It wasn't the figure, it was something else. The shadows at her feet seemed to stretch and twist, coming to life, sliding like liquid toward her legs. Her heart hammered against her chest as she looked down and saw the dark shapes creeping closer. The walls, too, were alive now. She could hear them, groaning and creaking, as though they were made of something other than wood and plaster. Something was coming through them, and just when she thought it couldn't get worse, the whispers returned. Only this time, they weren't just whispers. They were voices, low and guttural, the words coming together now clearer. Samantha couldn't understand them, but the tone was unmistakable. The voices were mocking her, taunting her, telling her that it was too late. She couldn't escape. Her legs finally obeyed, and she ran for the door, her hands trembling as she grabbed the handle and yanked with all her strength. It wouldn't budge. The door was locked. Again, the figure moved toward her now, its limbs stretching unnaturally as it advanced, its shape growing more and more defined. It was close enough now that Samantha could feel the cold emanating from it, a chill that sank deep into her bones. The temperature in the room dropped, the air turning frigid. She looked around desperately, but there was nowhere to go, no way out. She was trapped. A low growl vibrated through the floor, and suddenly, the figure stopped. It paused, its head tilting to the side, as if listening to something just out of sight. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a sickening lurch, the figure jerked forward, its hand stretching out toward her. In that moment, Samantha knew that whatever this thing was, it was alive, and it was coming for her. Story 4. The Whispering Shadows. On a stormy night in the heart of New York City, a small, dimly lit cafe called the Velvet Brew sat quietly at the corner of a narrow street. The cafe, though small in size, was a haven for the weary, offering an escape from the chaos of the bustling city. Its walls were lined with old bookshelves filled with dusty tomes, and the faint scent of coffee mixed with the smell of rain. People came here for comfort, to relax, and sometimes to forget. But on this particular evening, something felt different. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, while the heavy rain pounded the streets like a relentless drum. The city lights flickered in the distance, casting long shadows on the walls of the cafe. Inside, the warmth of the dim lighting and the hum of low conversation created a strange sense of intimacy. It was a place where secrets were whispered, where time seemed to slow, and where every corner seemed to hold a story waiting to be told. Evelyn, a woman in her late 30s with dark brown hair and piercing blue eyes, stepped inside the cafe. Her clothes were soaked from the rain, and her shoes left puddles on the wooden floor as she walked toward the counter. She ordered a cup of black coffee, her voice quiet but clear. She had come here to escape, to find a moment of peace after a long, exhausting day. The world outside was chaotic, filled with noise and uncertainty. Here, she could just sit, listen to the rain, and let her mind wander. She found a quiet corner, away from the small crowd that had gathered at the bar. The cafe was mostly empty, with only a few patrons scattered around, their heads buried in their own thoughts or books. Evelyn settled into the worn leather armchair, pulling her coat tighter around her for warmth. The sound of the rain against the windows was soothing, almost hypnotic. It felt like the world outside was fading away, leaving her in this small, safe bubble of comfort. As she sat there, her eyes drifted to a table nearby. There, lying on the table, was a book. The cover was old and worn, the edges frayed from years of use. It was open as though someone had been reading it and then abruptly left. The title on the cover caught her attention, Whispers in the Shadows. Something about the name intrigued her. It sounded like a story that belonged in a dark corner of the world, a tale meant to be told when the lights were low and the night was at its peak. Curiosity got the best of her, and she reached over to pick up the book. The moment her fingers touched the cover, a shiver ran down her spine. It felt cold, almost unnatural. She turned the pages slowly, the words on the pages seeming to come alive in the dim light. The stories within were unsettling, filled with eerie tales of voices in the dark, of shadows that moved without a source, and of forgotten places where time had no meaning. The deeper she read, the more absorbed she became. Each story seemed to echo her own fears, her own uncertainties. The rain outside began to intensify, the sound of the water hitting the pavement growing louder, as though it were amplifying the growing unease inside her. The cafe, once a place of calm, now felt like it was closing in on her. She glanced around, but the patrons seemed oblivious to her discomfort, lost in their own worlds. It was then that she felt a presence. It was subtle at first, like a shadow just out of the corner of her eye. She turned her head, half expecting to see someone standing behind her, but the space was empty. Her heart began to race, and she quickly looked back down at the book, hoping to distract herself from the growing sense of dread that was creeping over her. Just as she turned to the next page, she felt a tap on her shoulder. Startled, she jumped in her seat and spun around to face the source of the touch. Standing before her was an elderly man, tall and thin, with a long silver beard and piercing gray eyes. His appearance was almost otherworldly, like someone who had stepped out of another time. His clothes were worn and faded, but they carried an air of quiet authority. "Reading the book, are you?" the old man asked, his voice low and gravelly. Evelyn, still shaken by the touch and the strange energy in the room, nodded slowly. "Yes, it's strange," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The man smiled, a faint, knowing smile that made Evelyn feel even more unsettled. His eyes gleamed with an eerie intensity. "Be careful with books like that," he warned, his tone growing softer, almost as if he were sharing a secret. "Not all stories should be read. Some of them have a way of seeping into your life, into your mind, and once they've taken root, it's hard to ever escape them." Evelyn opened her mouth to respond, but the man was already turning away. He moved through the cafe with a fluid, almost unnatural grace, disappearing into the crowd as though he were never there. Evelyn sat frozen in her chair, her eyes still on the spot where the man had stood. What had he meant? Stories that seep into your life. Her hands trembled as she placed the book back on the table, the words still swirling in her mind. But the rain outside, the dark storm, and the man's cryptic warning seemed to be building a sense of unease that she couldn't shake. Her gaze drifted back to the book, but now the stories seemed darker. They didn't just describe the supernatural, they felt real, as though the shadows in the stories were already creeping into her own life. Evelyn tried to push the thought away, but deep down, she knew she couldn't ignore the connection between the words on the pages and the fear gnawing at her insides. Suddenly, the lights flickered. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to make Evelyn's pulse quicken. The sound of the rain intensified, the storm outside now raging in full force. The cafe, which had once felt like a safe haven, now seemed like a place trapped in time, suspended between the reality of the outside world and the terror of what might be lurking in the dark. Evelyn stood up quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. She needed to leave. She needed to get away from this book, from the shadows that seemed to whisper her name. But as she turned to walk toward the door, something stopped her. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the storm. The air grew colder, and the room seemed to grow darker, as though the very essence of the cafe was shifting. The figure didn't move, but Evelyn could feel its presence, a palpable weight in the air. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure took a step forward, moving closer and closer until, just as she was about to turn and run, the figure spoke. "Leave the book alone," the voice whispered. "You've read enough." The voice that whispered from the figure in the doorway echoed in Evelyn's mind, its coldness cutting through the warmth of the cafe. She froze, her feet unwilling to move, her heart pounding in her chest. The room seemed to grow darker with each passing second, as if the shadows themselves were creeping in closer, bending to the will of the figure standing before her. The figure's presence was overpowering. Evelyn could feel the air grow heavier around her, thick with an invisible weight. She tried to speak, to ask who the figure was, but her voice caught in her throat. The cafe, once a place of refuge, now felt like a prison, and the storm outside was no longer a comforting sound, but a raging force that mirrored the chaos building within her. The figure took another step forward, its movement slow and deliberate. Evelyn's eyes locked onto its silhouette, unable to make out any distinguishing features. It was as if the darkness itself had taken form, an entity that existed only in the space between light and shadow. Her pulse quickened, and a cold sweat broke out across her forehead. The cafe, the place she had once found solace, now felt foreign, hostile. The shadows no longer seemed like mere absence of light, but like something alive, something that was waiting for her to make a mistake. "Leave the book alone," the voice repeated, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was a command, a warning that cut through the air like a blade. "You've opened a door that should never be opened." Evelyn's mind raced, her thoughts a jumble of confusion and fear. The book, the strange stories, the old man's warning. Was it all connected? Was this figure part of the same nightmare? Her eyes darted back to the book lying on the table, its pages still open, as though waiting for her to continue. The figure stepped closer, its form becoming more defined in the dim light. Evelyn could now see the outline of a hood, obscuring its face, and long, flowing robes that seemed to ripple with an unnatural energy. A chill ran down her spine as she realized that this figure wasn't human. It was something else, something ancient, something born of the shadows themselves. "Put the book down," the figure demanded, its voice now low and ominous. "It will consume you, just as it has consumed those before you." Evelyn's breath came in shallow gasps, her hands trembling as she reached for the book. But as her fingers brushed against its cover, a surge of cold energy shot through her, freezing her in place. She could feel the power emanating from the pages, the darkness that seemed to pulse with life. The words were alive, and they were calling to her, pulling her deeper into their grasp. The cafe around her began to fade, the familiar sounds of the storm and the low murmurs of conversation disappearing into the background. Evelyn felt as though she were falling, as though the floor beneath her was slipping away. The shadows stretched and writhed, twisting around her like a living thing. And for a moment, she thought she saw faces, faint, pale faces, emerging from the darkness, their eyes hollow and empty, their mouths twisted in silent screams. She reached out, her fingers grasping the edges of the book, her grip tightening with a mixture of fear and desperation. But as she pulled it toward her, the faces from the shadows seemed to draw closer, their eyes locked onto her. She could feel their icy presence creeping in, brushing against her skin like an unseen hand. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the temperature dropped sharply, the chills settling deep into her bones. "Stop!" The figure's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "You cannot escape what you've unleashed." Evelyn's hands shook violently as she tried to close the book, but it wouldn't budge. The pages seemed to fight her, pushing back with an unnatural force. The stories within the book were no longer words on paper. They were memories, experiences, things that had happened to others, things that would now happen to her. The realization hit her like a wave. This wasn't just a story. This was real. This had always been real. She could feel herself being drawn into the story, her own reality blurring with the terrifying words on the pages. She was no longer sitting in the cafe, no longer in the present. She was somewhere else, somewhere dark, somewhere that didn't exist on any map. The sound of the storm outside grew louder, deafening, and Evelyn's senses began to overload. The shadows pressed in from all sides, surrounding her, suffocating her. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The faces from the darkness reached out to her, their hands cold and clammy, their fingers brushing against her skin like icy tendrils. She could hear their whispers now, indistinguishable from the rain. They were calling her name, begging her to join them. "Help me!" Evelyn's mind screamed, but the words never left her. Her breathing became more frantic as the room seemed to spin around her. The cold was unbearable now, a biting chill that felt like it was carving its way into her very soul. She wanted to run, but her body was frozen in place. The faces in the shadows closed in, their gaping mouths opening wide as though they were about to devour her whole. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through her chest, and she stumbled backward, her hand still gripping the book. The pain intensified, spreading through her body like wildfire, burning through her veins. She gasped for air, but the room had grown suffocating, the walls closing in around her. "Leave!" the figure shouted, its voice filled with urgency. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." But it was too late. The darkness had already taken hold. With a final, desperate effort, Evelyn slammed the book shut, hoping to break free from its grasp. For a brief moment, everything went still. The storm outside, the shadows, the whispers, they all paused, as though the world was holding its breath. But then, the figure in the doorway stepped forward once more, its hand raised in a silent command. "You've done it now," the figure said quietly, its voice low but filled with regret. "There is no going back." Evelyn looked around, her mind reeling, her heart racing. The cafe was gone. The patrons were gone. Everything was gone. She was alone, trapped in a void of darkness, with nothing but the book and the figure that seemed to exist only to watch her suffer. The shadows began to close in again, their grip tightening around her like a vice. She could feel herself being pulled deeper into the abyss, her body frozen, her mind screaming in terror. "Get out," she cried, but the words were lost in the void. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, watching her, as the darkness swallowed her whole. Story 5. The Forgotten Ones. The night was heavy with rain, a constant drumming on the rooftops of the small town. It wasn't the usual sort of storm that stirred feelings of comfort, the kind that made you want to curl up by the fire. This storm felt different. It felt like a warning. The wind howled, causing the trees to bend and sway in unnatural ways. The air was thick with an oppressive sense of foreboding, as though something ancient was about to wake. Catherine stood on the front porch of her family's old house, watching the rain fall in sheets. The old house, a Victorian-era structure, had always felt like it was alive. Its creaky floorboards and high, darkened windows seemed to whisper secrets, and the walls had an aura of being both welcoming and suffocating. She had spent most of her childhood here, but the strange sensations she had always felt in the house had never truly gone away. If anything, they had only intensified as she got older. Tonight, Catherine had returned to the house after years of being away. The reason for her return was one she couldn't explain, a pulse she had felt since receiving the letter. It had arrived a week ago, sealed in black wax, the handwriting unfamiliar, yet oddly familiar at the same time. "Come home," it had said. "The time is now." No return address, no signature, just the words that haunted her every night since. The house stood there, waiting for her. The wind seemed to sigh as she took a step back, entering through the creaking front door. Inside, the house smelled of dust and old wood, but it was still the same as it had always been. The same paintings on the walls, the same grand staircase, the same dim lighting that flickered ominously. The house seemed unchanged by time, but Catherine felt that it had been waiting for her all along. As she stepped deeper into the house, the familiar sound seemed off. The house creaked, but this time it felt louder, more deliberate, as if the house itself was trying to communicate. The shadows in the corners stretched further than they should, creeping along the walls as though they had a life of their own. Catherine felt her heartbeat quicken. She remembered the stories her grandmother used to tell her as a child, stories about the house being alive in some strange, inexplicable way. She had always dismissed them as the ramblings of an old woman, but now, standing here in the heart of the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house felt wrong. Her feet led her toward the living room, though she wasn't sure why. Something compelled her forward, like an invisible hand guiding her steps. The fireplace was cold, and the old leather chairs that had always been arranged around it were now positioned haphazardly, as if someone had been sitting there recently. But the room felt strangely empty. The air was still, and though the storm raged outside, the silence inside the house was deafening. It was then that she saw it, a large, ornate mirror hanging on the far wall. She had never remembered it being there before, though she had spent countless hours in this room as a child. The mirror seemed out of place, as if it had always been there, yet at the same time, as though it had only just appeared. Its frame was a mix of intricate patterns, twisting vines and faces that seemed to change when you weren't looking directly at them. It was beautiful, but unsettling. There was something about it that made her skin crawl, as though the very object itself had been waiting for her. As Catherine walked closer, her reflection began to distort. It wasn't that she looked different. She felt different, as though the reflection was showing her someone else entirely. The flickering light from the storm outside cast strange shadows on the mirror surface, and she could have sworn she saw something moving just out of the corner of her eye. A figure, a shadow. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the surface, unsure if she was seeing things or if something truly was inside the glass. "Is someone there?" she whispered, her voice trembling, but there was no response. The figure in the mirror remained motionless, and for a moment, Catherine thought she had imagined it. But when she blinked, the figure shifted again. It was a face, pale, hollow eyes, and an expression of deep sadness. It stared back at her unblinking. It wasn't her face. She stumbled back, gasping for air. But the reflection didn't change. It wasn't her anymore. The face in the glass wasn't hers. And yet it was almost as though the reflection was showing her something from a past she didn't recognize. The figure's eyes locked onto hers, and a cold wave of terror washed over her. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice shaky. But the figure did not respond. The whispers began, low at first, barely audible, like the faint rustling of leaves. But as Catherine stood frozen, the whispers grew louder. They were not coming from the house. They were coming from the mirror itself, as though the glass had become a portal to another world. "You shouldn't have returned." The voice was raspy and ancient, like the sound of a long-forgotten memory. Catherine's hands shook as she reached out to touch the cold glass, and as her fingers made contact, a jolt of energy shot through her, pulling her closer to the mirror. She tried to pull back, but it was as if the mirror had taken hold of her, sucking her into its depths. The room around her began to fade. The walls, the floor, the furniture, they all began to dissolve into nothingness. The only thing that remained was the mirror, its surface now impossibly deep, as if it had no end. Catherine's breath came in short gasps as she found herself sinking into it, her body being drawn forward as though it were made of liquid. The darkness behind the glass began to grow, and the figure in the reflection grew larger, its hollow eyes widening in anticipation. Suddenly, the figure reached forward, and Catherine felt a cold, skeletal hand brush against her face. She recoiled in terror, but she couldn't move. The hand pressed against her skin, sending a chill so deep into her soul that it felt as though the very essence of her being was being siphoned away. The whispers grew louder, frantic now, swirling around her in a cacophony of voices. "The forgotten ones have come for you." The words echoed in her mind, the tone cold and unrelenting. Catherine tried to scream, but no sound escaped her. Her body was trapped, her mind screaming for release. But the mirror was relentless. And then, just as she thought she would be consumed entirely, a crack appeared in the mirror surface. As Catherine's fingers brushed against the cold glass of the mirror, a surge of energy coursed through her, pulling her deeper into its depths. The world around her dissolved into a swirling vortex of shadows and whispers. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The darkness enveloped her, and for a moment, she felt as though she were falling through an endless abyss. Suddenly, the sensation stopped. The darkness receded, and Catherine found herself standing in a vast, desolate landscape. The sky above was a swirling mass of storm clouds, casting an eerie glow over the barren ground. The land was dry and cracked, as though it hadn't seen rain in centuries. In the distance, she could make out the silhouette of a figure standing alone, facing away from her. Compelled by an unknown force, Catherine began to walk toward the figure. With each step, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift and change, as if the very earth was alive. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing in her mind. "You shouldn't have come back." The voice was familiar, yet distant, like a memory she couldn't quite place. Her heartbeat quickened, and an unsettling feeling of dread began to creep into her chest. As she approached the figure, it slowly turned to face her. The figure's face was pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through her soul. The face was unrecognizable, but somehow, Catherine felt an undeniable connection to it. A chill ran down her spine as she took a step back, realizing that the figure's expression mirrored her own fear. Was this what she was meant to find? "Who are you?" Catherine whispered, her voice trembling. "Why am I here?" The figure smiled, a cold, unsettling smile. "I am you," it replied, the voice distorted and warped. "Or rather, I was—" Before Catherine could respond, the figure reached out and touched her hand. A jolt of energy shot through her, and in that instant, the world around her began to crumble. The ground beneath her feet split open, and the sky above shattered into a million pieces. The sound of the sky breaking echoed in her ears, a deafening crack that seemed to reverberate in every bone of her body. Catherine fell weightless through the endless void. The darkness consumed her, pulling her deeper into the abyss. The whispers grew louder, now clear and haunting. "You can't escape," they hissed. "You're already one of us." The ground below her was made of blackened stone, jagged and sharp. Her body hit the surface with a thud, but there was no pain. She stood up, disoriented, her heart racing in her chest. The world around her had transformed once more. It was no longer the barren landscape, but now a dark, twisted version of her childhood home. The walls of the house were warped and decayed, the windows cracked and shattered. The air was thick with the scent of mold and rot, and the floor creaked beneath her feet as though the house itself was alive, watching her every move. The whispers were now louder, growing louder with each step she took. "You should have stayed away," they echoed, each word dripping with malice. As Catherine moved deeper into the house, she heard the sound of something scraping against the walls. Her breath caught in her throat as she followed the sound, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. In the center of the living room stood a mirror, much like the one she had encountered earlier. But this time it was cracked, its surface reflecting a distorted image of herself. She stepped closer to the mirror, her reflection warping and twisting as if mocking her. The figure she had seen earlier in the desolate landscape appeared once more, standing behind her in the reflection, its hollow eyes staring at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "You're not meant to be here," the figure said, its voice echoing in her mind. "You never were." With a sudden burst of fear, Catherine turned to run, but the house seemed to shift and contort around her. The walls closed in, and the floor beneath her feet gave way, sending her plummeting into darkness once again. This time, however, she did not fall alone. Hands reached out from the void, grabbing her legs, her arms, pulling her into the abyss. The darkness pressed in on all sides, suffocating her. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the void, her body frozen in terror. The hands that gripped her began to tighten, their fingers like iron, their touch cold and unyielding. They pulled her deeper into the blackness, and for a moment, Catherine felt as though she were being torn apart. Her mind raced, struggling to make sense of what was happening. Was this a dream? A nightmare that she couldn't escape? Or was this the end? But just as she felt her consciousness slipping away, a faint light appeared in the distance. It flickered like a dying star, offering her a glimpse of hope. She reached out for it, her fingers stretching toward the light, her heart pounding in her chest. The hands released her, and she was pulled forward, toward the light, toward something, someone, that she could not yet understand. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to our channel, American Pulse and Paranormal, and hitting the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support means the world to us. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Share your thoughts and feelings about the story in the comments below. Your feedback helps us create content that resonates with you. Thank you for being a part of our community.